Chapter 9. I seemed to be swimming up through dark, murky waters. I heard sounds, but they had no meaning. I sighed deeply and stopped, struggling for consciousness. Almondo's voice reached me. His heart is beating all right now. I lay there in my stupor, picking up the fragments of consciousness. Finally, I opened my eyes. Almondo and Gloria were kneeling beside me. "I will try to say something original," I said, weakly. "What time is it?" "It's about 1 minute since you fell out of your chair." "Our friends were back," I murmured, closing my eyes again. "Will he be all right?" Gloria asked, anxiously. "Yes," Almondo answered. "He's a bit more rugged than most." "Was it his heart?" she asked. "Not exactly. General organic collapse. Our unseen friends tried to kill him. Fortunately, he has the vitality of youth, so he will come around soon." There was a pause, then Gloria said, "Youth must be a far different thing to you." "I wouldn't say so," Almondo answered. But he's 140 years old." Almondo laughed. "If he's 140, you have wings, my dear. I think that was his idea of a jest." "Oh?" "If the medical records on board our ship were accurate, he would be, let me see, 34 of this planet's years." "Almondo, you've betrayed me," I said, opening my eyes again. "How can you expect me to be a wise and intelligent leader in the eyes of Gloria if you give away all my secrets?" I struggled upward on one elbow, noting with satisfaction that good humor had been restored. Almondo helped me to my feet, keeping his arm about me. "You had me worried for a while," Gloria said. "Be of good cheer, my followers," I said, loftily. "I shall save you from your awful fate." I sank weakly into a chair. "I think I will rest a moment before I save you, if you don't mind." They laughed, and Almondo began gathering up the dishes. "I'll take care of those," Gloria said. "I'm not yet so old that I can't carry them," Almondo replied, putting them in the sink. He did, however, sit down next to me, allowing Gloria to finish clearing the table. She placed the balance of the dishes in the sink, then began washing them and setting them to one side to dry. "Feeling better now?" Almondo asked. "You look better." "Yes," I sighed. "It was certainly a very touchy situation. He struck without warning. I began to get the best of him when another struck. I was quite sure that I would join the star gods, but they both disappeared." Gloria turned from the sink. "You know of the star gods too?" "Of course," I replied. "They're known to us as the Elohim, the creators of everything we see, and even the things we cannot." Gloria then proceeded to give me a quick outline of the beliefs on her planet. While the names were a bit different, the details all seemed to be oddly similar. Almondo listened thoughtfully. When she was finished, he muttered, "I would not think worlds this far away from the Union would know of such stories. However, it does seem possible." "Well, frankly, I've always thought that those who belong to the Union were the only ones taught the stories of the Elohim, yet it seems they are not limited to our own set of understandings," I said, a bit in disbelief. "It does seem odd that two entirely different races should—" "Cultures," Almondo interrupted. "She is of the same races as you and I." "Really?" I inquired. "I suppose you may be right, Almondo. After all, we share a similar bond to the star gods. It's only curious that the code is not found in a purer form. After all the star gods insisted—" "Right now," Almondo interrupted, "I would rather not explore the philosophy any further." I smiled. "As you wish." It is an interesting subject, though. How do you know I'm of the same race? Gloria asked. Her cheeks were slightly pink, I noted. Armando leaned back. Oh, there are certain characteristics, such as patterns on the fingertips, which to my mind indicate a common origin. Although your physical structure is much smaller, it's distinctly the same as ours. Transograph examination of your internal organs would show other traces. Besides, our race is very common in the universe, as far as we've explored it. Gloria turned back to the dishes. What do you plan to do now? Armando asked me. I'm not too sure, I admitted. I hope to build a machine, but there's a doubt in my mind as to whether or not I can do it. I'm not a technician, you know. I was hoping that Jovian would be able to guide me. I've given Jovian an anesthetic to promote healing, Armando answered. Consciousness may return tomorrow morning. However, memories may not be too clear, so I wouldn't press for data at once. Jovian needs time to rest and relax. I sighed. Oh, that's unfortunate. Perhaps I could help, Gloria suggested. That is true, I said, brightening. You have had technical training. What do you want to do? My ideas are this, I replied. We know that moderately short radio frequencies will blanket or prevent thought transference. I hope to somehow make a shell around this house of those frequencies, something indetectable, yet strong. Well, for that you'd need a radio transmitter, Gloria said. I shook my head. I don't think so. Many of the receiving sets on this planet are also miniature transmitters. They generate a frequency which almost coincides with the incoming signals, creating a beat effect, which varies with the strength of the incoming signal. I think one of the sets I purchased today has sufficient power. You don't sound like you need a technician, Gloria said, smiling. I laughed. Believe me, I do. I've summed up my knowledge on the subject. Gloria frowned for a moment. The Masters had a device for blanketing thoughts, and I used to work on them. It utilized a rotating antenna within a magnetic field. Is that the type of setup you want? Yes. I've seen such devices on our own world. They're used to prevent one from being distracted by outside thoughts. I have the electromagnets and some things I thought would make a suitable antenna. I only hope that one of the receivers I purchased can be converted to do the job. Let's go examine the sets and find out, she replied. Maybe it can be done. I rose from my chair. Now we're cooking with gas, I said. What in the name of the star gods does that mean? Armando asked. Frankly, I have only a general idea, but I think it means that we're efficient. These language corruptions make one seem brilliant in the eyes of these people for some unknown reason. Armando shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps I should have studied philosophy. It still doesn't mean anything. The three of us went into the small corridor by the front door. We'll need some space to work in, Gloria said. I have a bench here, I replied. Suppose we put it in the workshop. It was a rather long wooden affair whose legs screwed in. Armando helped me pick it up and carry it to our workshop. After I had assembled it, I returned, passing Gloria as she came in with an armload of tools. There were 3 more collapsible tables of various sizes which I brought in and set up. In a surprisingly short time, there was an amazing assortment of equipment in the room. At last, there were only 2 items left in the hallway, a heavy box and a small machine. I picked them both up and carried them into the workshop, setting them down on the small desk. Then I went over to the bench and picked up a pointed instrument with which to pry open the wooden box. Just as I was prepared to jab it into the space between the boards, Gloria caught my hand. "Don't!" she gasped. I looked at her blankly. "That is a circuit tester. It'll break." She reached behind on the bench, picked up a screwdriver, and proceeded to open my box. I felt just a little foolish standing there, letting her open the box for me. When it was open, I reached inside and lifted out the machine, setting it on the desk. "A typewriter!" she exclaimed. "What is it for?" Then her eye caught the other machine. "And what is that?" I was unreasonably pleased to be able to impart some information. "I'm a writer," I said, "and this," tapping the small machine, "is a dictating machine." She looked back at the typewriter. "Beautiful, isn't it?" "It runs electrically," I pointed out, taking pleasure in every explanation I could make. Almondo came into the room and stopped, staring at the typewriter. "What are you planning to do with that?" "On this planet, there are persons who write stories." "What?" "They're writings about events and people who do not exist. It's a form of amusement. These stories are purchased and printed for public consumption." "Now, why are you going to waste your time doing that?" Almondo asked. "Well, for one, it's an excellent occupation for someone who appears unusual. People on this planet expect certain eccentricities from writers. It will also provide a substantial background, and it may prove useful later." "Frankly, I think you got those things merely to play with," Almondo said. "You just like to pretend you're experimenting with the culture." "Oh, but I am experimenting," I said. "I'm learning more each day, and what I have learned and will learn in the future will be of value." "Well, I must admit that you've accomplished a good deal so far," Almondo replied. He walked over to the bench and closely examined some tools. "Now, what about you?" I asked Gloria. "Well, there's certainly enough here to work with," she replied. "Do you think we can build a machine?" "Yes, I think so." "Good. That'll give us the protection we need. What can I do to help?" She put me to work stringing out wires and plugging in things here and there, and shortly Almondo too was busily engaged. We labored away clumsily, but gaining experience with each thing we did. It was quite late when Gloria said, "Well, I suppose you're tired now?" "I'm not," I said. "Would you care to rest for a while?" "She's still suffering from the effects of food poisoning," Almondo said. "She must sleep." "Oh, I see," I murmured. "You don't sleep?" she asked incredulously. "You won't either after a while," Almondo informed. He fished in a pocket, brought out a small case, and opened it. He handed several amber-colored capsules to Gloria. "Take one of these now, one when you awaken and one just before you eat next. They'll help you to eliminate your accumulated poisons." She swallowed one of the capsules. "Seems very strange not to sleep," she said. "You'll get used to it in time, though," Almondo replied. "I'm really not as tired as I could be," she said. "Perhaps I can work a little longer." "You need not," I replied. "Well, if I finish this circuit," she pointed out, "you can finish the rest without my help." "Will it take long?" Almondo asked. "Another hour, more or less." I nodded. "I'll give you all the help I can." We again set to work. Between Almondo and myself, a wheel-like object was taking shape. It occurred to me suddenly that perhaps we wouldn't have power enough to run the machine, and I asked Gloria. "Well, there should be," she replied. "You have a stove that's rated at nearly 100 kilowatts." I laughed. "That means nothing to me, but I assume you're answering in the affirmative." "It doesn't mean anything to me either," she replied. "But I totaled all the numbers listed on everything, and it comes out to less than that." I nodded and went back to work. We labored in silence for a while, then Almondo looked up, puzzled. "Where are you going to put this thing?" "On the roof," I said. "It is flat, you know." Gloria held up two insulators. "Here they are," she said. "I have the cables running to these. Now, you'll have to bore a hole in the ceiling or the wall." "How big?" Almondo asked. just large enough to accommodate this tube between the insulators. A little larger wouldn't work. I have just the thing. Armando fished in his pocket. Where do you want it, Buck? I guess in this corner of the room, I replied. What are you going to do? Armando pointed. Right about there? I nodded. That is pretty near the center of the roof. It'll do. Armando pulled a small weapon from his pocket and placed the muzzle near the ceiling. Wait! I gasped. As the word left my lips, I was blinded by a brilliant flash. The smell of burning wood and plaster struck my nostrils, and I blinked my eyes attempting to see. Finally, I was able to see the ceiling and found a nest hole, nearly round, about 3 inches in diameter, directly above Armando. He still stood there, an incredulous look on his face, staring at the weapon. Well, it functions, he said, hesitantly. That, is about the right size, too, Gloria said in a small voice. Where did you get that? I demanded. Oh, I picked it up on an expedition. Well, I said, do you mind if I take that thing with me? Now that the display is over, I think I'll begin installing our device on the roof. Armando handed it to me readily. I placed it in my pocket, then picked up a length of rope from the supplies. When you get through with that thing, I said to Armando, bring it out and tie it on the rope. I'll haul it up. Armando mumbled something and nodded his head. I gathered up half of the lead-in insulators and carried them out to the backyard. I had some trouble getting the ladder to remain stable, but presently I was up on the roof. I crunched along on the gravel and after more difficulties managed to locate the hole. I kicked the gravel away from around it with my shoe, then laid down the thick rubber cuff. On top of this went the heavy glass bowl with long rods attached. It jerked under my fingers as those below fitted on the other half and fastened it down. When it was tight, I turned and walked back to the ladder. Armando emerged from the house, awkwardly manipulating the big wheel. It had a steel rim and was a little less than 3 feet in diameter. The heavy bronze spokes interlaced, forming a geometric design. 6 short spokes converged in the center on a short piece of shafting. This shaft, in turn, was fastened by an insulated coupling onto a small electric motor, which had a rather large, flat base for vertical operation. The 4 electromagnets were mounted on wooden bases which would bring them up to the height of the antenna so that the wheel would spin within the magnetic fields. The last item was a crude brush made of a piece of springy brass mounted on an insulator. This would rest against the shaft of the rotating antenna, conducting the high-frequency current to it. I pulled up the assembly in pieces, then Armando joined me on the roof. We wrestled the heavy electromagnets into place around the wheel and tightened everything down with heavy lag screws. We had to make several trips for tools and other items, and the sky was growing light when we were finally finished. It was stiff. My fingers hurt from a dozen cuts and bruises, but the major job was done. Warily, I followed Armando down the ladder and folded it down. As we closed the door behind us, Armando spoke for the first time in more than an hour. I hope all this effort is justified. I don't doubt that it will be. It certainly has been tedious, I admitted. Gloria was in the workshop, stretching heavy cables out on the floor. She must have awakened herself in some manner, or perhaps she hadn't slept. She smiled at us brightly as we entered. Well, it's almost done. We'll need some copper sheeting for shields, but aside from that, it's complete. Armando turned to me. Do you know where you're going to connect this up? Indeed I do, I replied. I pointed to a spot on the wall where a small metal plate was screwed. I took the trouble to trace the wires perceptively, and behind that plate are the wires that go to the stove. Gloria immediately picked up a screwdriver and knelt down before it. In only a moment, the plate was gone, and thick, heavy wires with taped splices appeared. I protested as she stripped off the tape from one. Wait, I'll shut off the electricity. It's all right, she said. It can't hurt you so long as you only work on one at a time. I murmured, but I stood nonetheless, watching tensely as she made the connections and taped them up again, one at a time. Finally, she pushed the wires to one side. "Could you bend out the corner of this plate?" she asked. "Then I could put it back on and let the wires come through." I did this, netting myself another cut in the process, then watched Gloria put it back. Then she turned, looked at the apparatus for a moment, and then said, "Just one more thing. If you can tighten down the bolts on our leads, I'll put the rubber covers on." With wrench in hand, I climbed onto the bench, tightened the bolts pointed out, barking my knuckles again, then stepped down. Gloria brushed a wisp of hair off her forehead as we stood back to survey the impressive machine on the bench. A bulky transformer surmounted by a perforated metal case stood on the left. The thick leads ran upward to the low-tension terminals on the lead and insulator, and then to the electromagnets. Next came the remodeled receiving set, the case removed, and improvised leads running helter-skelter over the chassis. One cable reached upward to the center terminal of the lead-in. An electric tachometer hung on the wall, and 3 more large meters lay on the bench, their wires running everywhere. There were assorted knife switches, hastily screwed on, and a big switch box dangled precariously on a single nail on the front of the bench. Gloria sighed and threw a lever on the side of the switch box. I winced, but nothing happened. Then, as Gloria manipulated something, the big glass tubes in the power supply lit up with a blue flare. She closed several knife switches and said, "Well, the electromagnets are working." Another switch closed, and I heard a low drone, which mounted to an almost inaudible hum. The needle on the tachometer crawled upward in proportion to the pitch of the whine. "There we are," she said. 350 RPM. "Is that good?" Almondo asked. Gloria nodded and snapped several more switches on the face of our improvised signal generator. After making several adjustments, she glanced at Almondo and myself. "You'll have to tell me when this begins to work," she said. I nodded and groped outward for a nearby mind. I found one not far away, then, almost imperceptibly, his mental impulses began to fade. "Just a little more," I murmured. She inched the dial a bit further. "More," I said. "Just a little." Again, she moved the dial. "Almost. Enough. There, that does it." I turned to Almondo. "Well, what do—" I stared at him in sudden realization. "I cut my hands," I exclaimed. "Our reactions were slowed," Almondo barked. "We were controlled." "Partly so," I replied. Jovian!" Almondo must have grasped the same thing at the same time, for we dashed through the doorway and burst into your room. It was empty. The 3 of us stood staring at the bed, only a slight depression indicating where you had been. I've not thought of Jovian for hours," Almondo said slowly. I should have known. I should have known." I wanted to beat my head on a wall. I cursed myself inwardly. Our minds had been subtly, ever so subtly, entered while we worked, perhaps even before we started, until our thoughts were directed by another. We noticed nothing. We saw nothing. And in our blindness, we thought we saw everything. Even our incredible accidents, cutting and bruising our hands, meant nothing to us. "Such stupidity!" I hissed. I hated myself thoroughly, loathed and detested my being. While I've been working with machinery, you are being carried off by those we hope to protect you against. "I will not rest until Jovian is back," I breathed. Gloria clenched her hands in front of her, the knuckles turning white. "It's my fault," she said, huskily. "It wouldn't have happened if—" "It could have happened more easily," I said. "Let's not blind ourselves to facts." Yes, Almondo agreed, warily. The avoidable is only avoidable when you anticipate it. Let us not blame ourselves. But what are we going to do? Gloria asked. We shall find Jovian, I said. It's the only obvious thing. I think I'd better do it, Almondo said slowly. He paused. Yes, this task is for me. I understand Jovian's condition, and I fear skilled training will be necessary. You could no doubt find Jovian, Bach, but then you could only rely on friendship and— He broke off. Yes, he said. That is what we must do. You will stay here, Bach, and I will look for Jovian. This was difficult for me to accept, but I couldn't protest, and it was pointless to seek arguments which would be necessarily fallacious. The time will be hard to bear, I said. True, Almondo replied, but you will be with me. Only partly, I sighed. The house is now insulated, shielded against both incoming and outgoing thoughts. You can take up some time by training Gloria to protect herself, Almondo said. It'll be to our advantage as well as hers, you know. I laughed. Obviously, I'm incapable of protecting anyone, let alone myself, but perhaps I've learned a bitter lesson. Almondo nodded. It is something that will not be repeated. Well, I should go now. We unpacked some clothing for Almondo. I helped him dress while Gloria packed some food and other items. You will give me some help with that cumbersome machine outside, I trust, Almondo said. Nothing that lives can pilot it without any degree of safety, I replied, but I will do my best. Good. Almondo adjusted a hat over his eyes and surveyed himself in the mirror. He scowled, then shrugged. We left the room and walked to the door together. Gloria met us there with a bag. I do hope you'll be all right, she said, and I hope you have success. I will, Almondo said, matter-of-factly. Perhaps you should go too, she said to me. I'll be all right here alone. Just about as safe as you would be in a den of Zerks. What's that? She asked. They eat flesh, I said. I'll describe them later sometime. By the way, Almondo said, opening the door, if I should be asked, what should I profess to be? A physician, I replied. You're qualified, and it accounts for the bag. A license is required and other formalities, but you can take care of that circumstance if it should arise. Yes, Almondo murmured. Now, just one more item. The weapon. I pulled it out of my pocket and handed it to him. You be careful of this thing, I added. It is dangerous. He expertly snapped it open and examined its contents. I know how to use it, he said. He dropped it into his pocket. Well, see you again soon. He clasped my hand briefly, smiled at Gloria, and walked out of the house. I followed him to the car. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, then glanced at me. Think we'll get out of this alive? He asked. Maybe, I answered. Maybe not. We're certainly going to leave an impression either way. True, and one does not live forever anyway. Well, we'll find that out when the time comes, I said, wryly. Almondo grunted and slammed the door. I helped him with the controls as he backed out and drove slowly up the street. When he was some distance away and progressing satisfactorily, I bid him a last goodbye and went back into the house. I feel terrible, Gloria said, closing the door. Oh well, I sighed. Almondo will produce some results, so don't worry. I'm not a vengeful person, but I do feel that for the protection of all concerned, I shall have to seek out and destroy these owners of the earth. Gloria's eyes blazed. Whatever they are, they're dreadful. They're worse, if possible, than the Murgots. Your former owners? I asked, absently. They, too, are due for something of a surprise. We went back to the workshop. The hum of the machines was soothing. In a way, it helped me to think, for they proved to me constantly that my thoughts were my own. The attack on me last night had been so violent. The ones before, so crude. The last, finesse. A finesse achieved only by an unanswered mind. Yet an advanced mind would not have done such a thing. Perhaps I had been justified in expecting only crude attempts. On the other hand, you were gone, and self-justification was mere rationalization. "Would you like to talk?" Gloria asked. "It sometimes helps." I sighed. "What would you like to talk about?" "Oh, I don't know," she replied. "To me, everything seems a bit confused. You're my rescuer, and yet you seem to need rescuing yourself." "You want us to take you with us?" I said. It was not a question. "Yes." "You don't know where you're going if we do. However, you expect better than what you found." "Could there be worse?" she asked. "If you're asking for my opinion, no. This is the nadir of existence." Gloria sank into a chair beside the workbench. I paced the floor silently for a moment, then sat down facing her. "I believe I can be honest with you, but what I'm going to tell you is, well, perhaps not what you expect. I'll preface it by saying that I will take you from this planet, and you may choose any place in this universe to live that is desirable to you." Her eyes sparkled, and I noted a trace of wetness on the lower lids. "However," I continued, "I cannot free you today, or tomorrow, or even next year. It'll be at least 5 years, and maybe more." Her eyes dropped, disappointment altogether too plain. "Uh, I'm willing to wait," she said, finally. "I've already waited a long time." "I'll tell you the whole story of why we're here so that you'll understand," I said. I recounted our flight and how it was accomplished, the crash in that other space, and the far worse crash on this world. I told about the night on the black waters and of my companions who would never leave this planet. I explained about those who had already left, about the flight which would take 5 years with hardly enough space to raise an arm and not quite enough to stand. And then I talked of you, how you had been injured, of my affection for you, of my frantic haste to find a place for you where you'd be safe. Gloria's eyes were intent upon me. You're you're very brave," she said. "Not at all," I replied. "You see, not all of us could go, and well, I have a job to do, and I need no ship in which to do it. Jovian couldn't go, and Almondo remained to care for Jovian. So Almondo alone sacrificed. I only did what was reasonable and necessary." "I don't think so," she murmured. "I think you're heroic." "It pleases me to have you think so," I admitted, "but it's not true." She smiled, studying my face. "You know," she said at last, "I think it'd be almost as nice as going there to hear you tell me about your home and your family and what it's like away from here." I started pacing again. "Gloria, life is a very interesting thing when you have a purpose in living. Perhaps I can give you something to hope for, but you mustn't cling to it nor become a slave to it. You wish to be free of oppression, but actually, if you are free of fear, you're free of everything. I don't fear this world, for if I did, it would conquer me. True, I may lose my life, but I must die eventually, so I fear nothing, and I'm free. I paused. I've spent years studying that. On this world, it's called philosophy, but on mine, it is something else, more all-embracing. I stopped pacing and sat down again. You will be free someday, Gloria. Either it'll be the freedom of life or the freedom of death. I know, she replied, and I'm not afraid to die. I guess I've been through too much to care one way or the other, but for some reason, I always go on hoping that someday life will be better. I smiled. And you think I'm brave? You're way ahead of me, Gloria. She smiled back. Well, we're in the same boat now. What? The phrase was unfamiliar to me. Oh, yes, I said, grinning. We certainly are. Tell me about you, she said, suddenly. What is your world like, and how do you live? I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Arkna is the name of my home planet. It's an unthinkable distance from here, almost in the heart of an intangible brotherhood of worlds called the Union. We're united by the code, a code of actions. The code originated on Arkna before there was life on this world, or at least before there was a civilization. I paused. Could it be, I wondered, that the owners of this planet had destroyed civilizations previous to this one? Perhaps this world was as old as Arkna. Suffice it to say, I continued, the code is so ancient that it is believed to have originated with the Elohim race, who was the creator of all these universes. However, there's no direct proof of this, and our history goes back 1,000 lifetimes. Our own scholars believe that Arkna was one of the earliest civilizations created, perhaps even the first fruit. Regardless, eventually my ancestors discovered space travel, and the worlds they found were young ones, much younger than Arkna, and to these they explained the code. No matter where they went, they left the code behind when they left, until one day they discovered that the Union existed. It has grown and prospered, and to this day it has not known war or strife, although it embraces races so alien that they are barely understandable to one another. No war? Gloria asked, unbelieving. I shook my head. How could there be? No matter what their appearances might be, under the code, all are brothers. It is the bond of life, and the code is for all who live. But what is the code? It's a code of actions, as I said, but I'll explain it to you in detail some other time. Many things will become understandable to you when I can explain en rapport. She nodded. What of Arkna? She paused. Arkna, she repeated. It's a beautiful name. Oh, Arkna is a little bigger than this world, although less dense. You would weigh a trifle less. The ground is quite resilient. Here it's hard. By careful breeding through the ages, the plants and animals on Arkna have been perfectly adapted to their environment, self-propagating and self-sustaining. There are no winds to scatter seeds, so the foods grow in patches. The soil contains much moisture, which the air deposits at night. The sky is pink, like a sunset here. The nature of our sunlight, plus a fine mist of suspended matter high in the air, maintain an even light throughout most of the day, and the nights are not dark. This blanket over our planet helps to maintain an even temperature, and there's no need for heavy clothing. Oh, this sounds so nice, Gloria said. It was very cold on the world where I was born. I sighed and leaned back in my chair again. We have age-old power plants which build matter, and in the building, we obtain power. To us, it's unthinkable to destroy matter, not only because it releases death in the form of radiation, but because our culture is founded upon building. That, in essence, is the heart of the code: creation. There's little to be done in the way of work on Arkna, because our machines harvest our food, build our homes and conveniences, carry us where we wish, and in short, accomplish most of the tasks upon which men spend their lives here, and more besides. We've built many cities, no two alike, but they're not like the cities here, for they cover wide areas, and there's no crowding. Since we can travel all around our planet in a short time, we may live where we please. In my city, the city of flowers, there's no industry or commerce. It's a retreat for thinkers and students. The dwellings are low and quite far apart compared to the cities here. Naturally, the outstanding feature is the flowers. Every possible flower that is good to the eyes or to the smell grows in abundance. They've been brought from every part of the Union and gradually adapted to their environment. My home is a modest dwelling, a little larger than this house, wherein I have my records and my books, my laboratory and my instruments, wherein I couldn't go on. I dropped my face forward on my hands and wept. I felt Gloria's hand brush my hair back. "Oh, don't," she whispered. "I shouldn't have asked. I'm so sorry. Please don't." I drew a shuddering breath. "Oh, I'm all right now. I'm sorry." "I'm the one that's sorry," she replied softly. "It was cruel and selfish of me to ask you." I raised my head, fishing in my pocket for a handkerchief. Gloria still knelt beside my chair and brushed my hair occasionally. "I feel so sorry for you," she said. "Why?" I asked, surprised. "I will be going back. I realize I've been forcing myself not to remember, not to think about Arkna. It was stupid of me. I feel much better for having talked about it." Gloria smiled and got to her feet. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "this has been a great relief. I've kept myself so tense not remembering, well, it's a bad thing." "But it's nice to have something to look forward to," Gloria replied. "I've had nothing to look forward to for a long time." "Yes, as I said, it gives one something to strive for." We sat thinking for a moment, then Gloria said, "Do you think I'd be happy on Arkna? Would anybody mind my being there?" "Why should they?" I asked incredulously. "Oh, I don't know. It's just, I've been a stranger on two worlds. It must be wonderful to have friends and families." "Did you have no friends on the world from which you came?" She looked at me, a strange blankness in her eyes. "We were slaves," she said flatly. "We weren't allowed to remain in one place very long. We lived like cattle. Some women had mates, but they were chosen by the masters, and they were only seen once. I was too small for mating, so I was given technical training." "How horrible!" We lapsed into silence again, each thinking our own thoughts. Presently I stirred and rose. "I think I shall contact Almondo." Gloria followed me to the door and stood silently watching me as I walked beyond the sphere of protection. The bright sunlight was warming, and it cheered me. A man walking down the street nodded to me as he passed, and I was pleased to nod back. I drew out a deep breath and sent out a call to Almondo. "How is everything?" "I couldn't say how everything is, but I'm fine. This monstrous machine is still running, although I'll never be the same for the treatment it has given me." "Of Jovian?" "Nothing." I almost suggested that Almondo find the Watcher, but I caught myself before the thought was formed. There was no point in giving away information, and it was possible that the owners of the planet might not know that we knew the Watcher. "I'll be back soon," Almondo flashed, cheerfully. "I'm about 1/3 done with the city. I think I can sweep this section of the country before nightfall." "I'll keep contacting you," I replied. "All right." Armando turned his thoughts back to the people around him, making vast sweeps, pausing when anything seemed significant. I turned and walked back into the house, and Gloria closed the door. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked. "I suppose," I replied. "Yes, now that I turn my attention to it, I find I am definitely hungry." We went into the kitchen, and I showed her the things I'd purchased and what to do with them. We found ourselves cheerfully working together as we prepared the food. In a few minutes, it was on the table, and we sat down. "The food is strange, but I admit it tastes good," Gloria said. I smiled. "The variety is rather limited, but we'll find more things that are edible." She took a bite of food, then looked up at me with her large eyes. They seemed suddenly sad. I suppose I'm a poor substitute for someone else across the breakfast table. "Who? Armando?" I asked casually, my mind only half attuned to the conversation. "No, I was—" She took another bite, then asked, "Do people marry on your world? I mean, can you be with anyone you wish?" "Yes." Do do they fall in love?" I glanced at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "Well, it's hard to explain," she said thoughtfully. "There's no love on my world, though some have managed to be together for a while. Here, they just think they're in love, but it's an illusion. The owners do the matching. I've seen it happen enough times." I saw tears welling in her eyes. "And sometimes, once in a while, they may fall in love, but those things can tear them apart at any time." She exhaled sharply. "Yes, I know," I said quietly. "My father and mother ran away together, and I was 8 years old before they found us. I guess they could have found us any time, but they just didn't bother. I remember them well. They were so happy together." Suddenly, she broke down. "It was such a little while," she sobbed. "I never saw either of them again." She wept bitterly, and although I don't remember rising, I found myself kneeling next to her, trying to soothe her. She turned to me and buried her face in my shoulder. "Don't cry," I said. "We'll leave here soon. It won't be long. Just keep in mind that there are better worlds, and you have my word, you will see them." She drew a long breath and stopped crying. She still held my shoulders with her fingers. "Love, as you call it," I said, "is found everywhere in the Union, for without it, there would be no Union. It's a little hard to explain. You see, love and friendship and freedom, all these things we have, and yet we don't consider them precious, for we've never been without them. Where there is no love or freedom or friendship, then I imagine they're deemed the most valuable of attainments. Don't judge the rest of the universe by what you've seen." She raised her head and smiled. "You're nice," she said. "You're the nicest person I've ever known." I felt oddly uncomfortable. I, there are many, there are lots of people nicer than me," I stammered. "The universe is full of them." She sighed. "I'm sorry I carried on like this. You must think I'm a baby." "Of course not," I said. "After all, it wasn't too long ago that our positions were reversed." I got to my feet. "There's no point in repressing these things, you know. It only makes for trouble later on, and you feel better, too." "Much," she admitted. I walked to the other side of the table and sat down. We continued our meal in silence, occasionally looking at each other. I found it very pleasant to study her face. I realized without much surprise that I was falling in love with this girl, and for no particular reason. Perhaps it was because all the women I had ever met were more dynamic and forceful than myself. Or perhaps it was because philosophy is a solitary thing, requiring much thinking. I sighed. She looked up at me, her eyes strangely soft, or perhaps it was my imagination. I realized then that it was gratitude I saw in her eyes, and that she might be confusing it with true affection. This was a problem, one to be met sooner or later, and at the present time, I could think of nothing to do. I rose from the table. "I think I'd better find Almondo," I said. She nodded and again followed me to the door. She watched me all the while I stood on the lawn communicating with Almondo. He'd found nothing and was somewhat less cheerful. He attempted to appear light-hearted, but he couldn't mask his thoughts well enough. "I thought of you then, lost, perhaps dead, but either way, gone." I became depressed, for there seemed so little that I could do. But I determined that although for the present I could do nothing for you, I could at least help Gloria. I didn't forget you because of her, nor have I ever forgotten you. You were, and are, my dearest friend, and never once did I dismiss you from my mind. I thought of you and continued to think of you, hoping that I might unearth some significant factor which would lead us to you. "Nothing yet?" Gloria asked. "No, nothing yet," I replied. "I wish I could help," she said. "I seem to be only a burden. If it weren't for me, you could be out looking too." "Almondo's right, though," I answered. "He alone is capable of caring for Jovian. I'm not qualified and would probably do more harm than good." "I suppose." I felt very weary all of a sudden. I knew most of it came from the still lingering effects of the poisonous food chemicals. "Perhaps I'll lie down for a while," I said. "I'm still suffering from systemic poisoning. I may fall into a stupor." "Sleep," I explained, correcting myself. "If so, wake me up in an hour or so. I want to keep in close touch with Almondo." She nodded. "Is there anything else I can do?" "Nothing that I know of," I said. I felt slightly dizzy, but it failed to register on my mind as being important. Gloria walked with me to the door of my room. "I'll call you in an hour," she said. "And don't worry. Try to rest." I nodded, closed the door, and surveyed the room, unbuttoning my shirt as I did so. Presently, I slid into the bed and dropped my head on the pillow. The dizziness seemed more pronounced. I imagined it would go away upon resting, decided that it was some after effect of the food. I became unconscious almost at once. Consciousness ebbed and flowed. Time seemed to have no existence. I remember vague images, distorted things that I saw, and I opened my eyes occasionally. Then the tide of blackness would sweep back. I felt peculiar pains at varying intervals, and I tasted water in my mouth often. Once, I choked on it. Then the blackness seemed complete for a long time.